Thompson. Welcome to another Escape to Gaming. Today I'm really pumped to bring you a brand new kind of a reflections of my time growing up in the 70s. I've had a couple friends that have asked me about it, and I thought I'd take some time kind of put together a few thoughts on it and convey them in this kind of a series here on my time as a gamer in the 70s, which is very exciting. You know, back in the 60s, went to a lot of arcades. Back then it was really pinball and other attractions that they had at that time. And even in the early, almost the mid-70s, arcades were pretty much unchanged from how they were in the 60s. But during this time in the late 60s, we did watch a lot of great science fiction. You had, great movies like Planet of the Apes and 2001 Space Odyssey. But my favorite at the time was Star Trek. I just was obsessed with every episode of the original Star Trek series. My dad would stay up. It was one of my fonder memories with my dad was staying up, or my grandparents' house or at home, and watching Star Trek. A couple years later, they came out with the animated series in the early 70s, which I'd watch on Saturday morning cartoons, which is fantastic. So these were great times to be a kid. You kind of were looking to the future, really excited about all the things that were coming. And also, we kind of fed on a heavy diet of science fiction movies at the time. Aside from 2001, you had fantastic films like Silent Running, and a little bit later, awesome movies like Logan's Run, which kind of really depicted a future of, fun and hedonism that was coming in the future. So these were the things that we kind of kept us gravitating towards electronic gadgets, anything that was new. Around this time, Palm came out, which was greatly and widely accepted. No one had seen anything like it. As simple as it was, again, it was electronics. Now, we also were into slot cars and electric train sets. Kind of anything that was electronic or computerized was something that we all were excited about. So part of the 70s culture was not just going on camping trips and fishing and canoe trips and sporting events, but was arcades, which were pretty much everywhere. They were in, restaurants. They were in they had these soda fountain, ice cream parlors. There'd always be a couple machines. You'd see them even in bars. They were arcades, places for family fun centers were everywhere. Some of them kind of incorporated miniature golf with them as well. So it was kind of part of the American landscape and a great pastime for many people, which of course I love more than almost anything else. I never was really good at sports, but I love the arcades. I like being around the excitement of just the sounds and the colors and, swilling down sodas and bags of chips and stuff like that. Great times. A good time to be a kid. Now, growing up in the 70s, we didn't have a lot of the luxuries that we kind of take for granted today with the flat screens and DVD players and handheld gaming consoles or regular ones or PC games or we didn't have any of these gadgets. Really, it was a much simpler time. You had a telephone, usually a little 13-inch black and white TV with a grainier than hell picture that you could barely watch. I remember my dad finally traded the 13-inch TV, black and white one, and we ended up getting this really nice RCA 19-inch color, which to me was just huge, and it was just awesome. So I really enjoyed watching a lot of those fantastic 70s TV shows at the time on it. But again, getting back to the arcades, I'd look for any reason to go out to them. And I had a couple of good friends that had big families, lots of brothers and sisters, and quite often I'd go over and spend the night over at their house. And, we knew it was going to be an evening of miniature golf and hitting the arcade. So we're over there chomping at the bit, all sugared out on Cokes, because my mom would let me drink Cokes at home. So over there I could just have all the sodas and ice cream and crap that I could pack my pie hole with. So anyway, we were sitting there. Usually the evening would consist of, on a Friday night, waiting for the old man. The guy's dad had kind of a 50s crew cut, sitting, got a stern look, sitting in a chair, reading his papers, pounding down beers at the time. And we're just waiting to go. Oh, God, is he done yet or what? Finally, you'd see him get up from his chair, cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He goes, "All right, kids, ready to go to the arcades?" And that would be it. We'd be off. He had this big Chrysler wagon. We'd all pile into it, wood grain galore inside now, which was awesome as a memory looking back on it. So we'd all get in there, no seatbelts, naturally. This is back in the 70s. All the kids are raising hell in the back seat. Their father's, "Everyone in? All right, let's go." So we'd go, and you have still a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. The inside of the car is suddenly filled up with smoke like a pool hall. We didn't care. We're going to the arcades. That's all we cared about. So he's up front, changing the channel. We're raising hell in the back seat. And eventually we'd get there. We'd spring from the car. Dad would be, shortly behind us. Give us all a couple bucks. We'd get a hot dog or a bag of chips and a Coke. And then we'd hit our favorite machines. And boy, was it an evening of fun. So we'd spring into the arcade and we'd race towards our favorite games, which at the time were brand new. All of these new electronic games which are quickly hitting the scene we had never seen before. You had games like Breakout, very addictive. just mesmerizing between the colors and the sounds, and you couldn't get enough. It was kind of like a Pong on steroids. Quickly after that, we had Night Driver, which I really loved because I love cars. You had kind of a little overlay of a plastic car thing that would be right in the front part of the screen, overlapping the screen, and you felt like you were driving at nighttime on this road, and it would get more and more challenging. I could frankly never get very far into it. I really stunk at the game, but my friend would beat me consistently. I was always jealous because he got extended time and I didn't on that one. But it was a fun game to watch and play either way. Quickly, not long after that, we started going back to the arcades again, and I discovered this great new game, Seawolf, which I just absolutely loved. You had this awesome periscope. Just the graphics on the cabinet alone would get me all excited and worked up. I kind of feasted on a lot of World War II movies at the time. My grandfather served in World War II in the Solomon Islands with a lot of kind of great stories at the time. So I felt like I was my granddad, you know, kind of looking through the periscope and hunting down enemy ships, and just the sights and sounds of the mines and the ships and the colors and everything was very captivating. I worked very hard at trying to get good scores in that game. I still sucked at it, but had a lot of fun. Even when the quarters were gone, I'd watch my buddies play it for hours on end. I just never get tired of playing Seawolf. Another game that quickly came out not long after that, which became my favorite arcade game for quite a while through the 70s and even into the early 80s, was the game Sprint. I could never get enough of having a steering wheel and a gas pedal. I felt like I was my dad driving a car. You know, it was awesome. So, you know, you're spinning. It was like early drifting almost. You're spinning around the corners, cranking the wheel, hitting the brakes. It's the only game that I dominated in against my friends and had a lot of fun with that game. They could never beat me at it. It's one thing, well, the game that I probably put the most quarters into was Sprint. Around the same time, we'd also hit a lot of arcades that were kind of in the movie theaters as well. So, you know, naturally at the time, we went to go see Jaws and, of course, Star Wars. I mean, I could do a whole segment just on seeing those two films alone. And quite often, in lines or even after you saw the film, sometimes we go and see the film again, but before we queue up in line, we'd race to the arcade. There'd usually be a half a dozen to a dozen great machines, and Sprint was always in there, or Seawolf, or one of my favorites. So, just the pop culture at the time in the 70s were just very good memories. I mean, looking back on just the music, the overall decor of the homes that we lived in, the places that we watched our TV shows, being at those movies, hearing the tunes at the time, our favorite bands and what have you, it was very, very awesome. I'll never forget the simplicity and the fun of the 70s. Many people didn't like it. They kind of wanted something beyond that, but I always appreciated it and always had a good time. So at this time, now we're kind of approaching the late 70s. I got a little bit more mobility as a kid. Now I got a really cool bike and, you know, riding wheelies, and we build little ramps and do jumps and have a lot of fun outdoors. And skateboarding became a real big part of our culture. At the time, it was all new. I mean, we didn't have everything's been kind of done today, but at the time, you could be that next kid that could build the ramp or get vertical or whatever. So we always felt like we were on the cutting edge of everything that was new, whether it be video games, the films that we saw at our favorite theaters, or on our skateboard. So it was really a great time to be alive as a kid, kind of growing up. But what would happen is that now I have the mobility, but I don't have the money. So I just go on these missions to hunt for change in quarters. I just knew there was money in the house. I'd be combing through the cushions under the couch, looking everywhere, going through the dresser drawers of my mother's dresser, kitchen drawers, ransacking. My dad had a Ford Granada at the time, combing through the ashtray. It'd always be usually $1.50 or so and change in there. So, you know, I'm siphoning as much money as I can. I almost felt like a drug enforcement agent going through a dealer's house. I mean, it was just really, it was over the top. And my mother had a talk with me one day, said, "Son, you got to stop stealing money. I notice this money missing all over the place." So she kind of encouraged me to get a job. And she got me some babysitting jobs, which actually was quite helpful. I started mowing lawns at some of my neighbors. Usually you get about $2 to mow a yard back then. I mean, kids today would laugh at that. You couldn't even buy a candy bar for that today. But at the time, $2, that was a lot of fun. And I'd race off, take my bike, and wheelie down to the arcades or the local little sandwich shop, which they had a couple of machines at. So I had a lot of fun with that, but eventually I got a paper route, and that really kind of fueled my fetish for the arcades. I just would virtually, almost every day or every other day, would be hitting the arcades. It was like a common place. You didn't even have to lock your bike up. Everyone knew everyone else. You just throw your bike outside on the sidewalk, jump inside, grab a Coke, and I, usually chainsaw through a bunch of ice cream sandwiches too, because now I've got a few bucks in my pocket. Which, around this time we moved. And so, again, you're in a whole new school, you got to make new friends, and things kind of change. And, when you're young, you just kind of have to pretty much have to go along with the changes. Their parents didn't really like and tolerate a lot of complaining back then. It was what it was. Today everyone's feelings are, have to be considered. But at the time, you moved, and so you just make new friends. Well, luckily, right down the street was my new best friend, Johnny. Now, Johnny's one of these rich SOB kids whose dad was a doctor. He's the kind of kid that got a brand new dirt bike every year. I get a brand new game, a board game or something, and would be very happy with that. But Johnny pretty much had everything that a kid could want. So Johnny quickly became one of my favorite stops after school, or pretty much for the weekends. And I had wonderful memories of sleepovers at Johnny's for the whole weekend. It was awesome. So at the time we had these AFX, they were made by Aurora, these electric racing sets, which we slowly started kind of building our sets larger and larger and buying more cars. Of course, his was epic. It was huge, naturally. But we did that for quite a while. I remember like a whole summer doing that and then hitting the arcades. But then all of a sudden the new Atari 2600 came out. This game system was off the hook. All of a sudden now you have these arcade experiences, including some of the games that we had seen in the arcades in your own home, on your own TV set. I had never seen anything like it. I said, this is the ultimate right here, just to be able to play our favorite games at home. So we spent a disproportionate amount of time playing these games. You had wonderful games at the time. We had Combat, Starship, Street Racer was one of my favorites at the time, Indy 500, and probably my favorite on that system at that time, in the late 70s, was Air Sea Battle. We could never get enough of these games. So we, virtually pull all-nighters, watching TV, and then playing the Atari 2600. The parents didn't really mind us watching TV at night, but during the day they'd kick us out and we'd ride dirt bikes or skateboards or something like that. Now, my friend Johnny had an older brother who was even more spoiled than Johnny was. It was his big brother, Steve. Well, Steve was another kind of a very privileged kid. His dad went out and bought him, after he graduated from high school, a really cool 68 Camaro. I mean, it's just all completely dialed in naturally. So this soon became kind of our transportation, or kind of like our time machine, our way to get to the arcades and to the movies. So quite often the mother just said, you kids are spending an unhealthy amount of time in front of the TV. You got to get out of the house. So she'd always give, she would give Steve the money to take Johnny and I out to the movies or to take us to the arcades. This is around the time we saw great films like Dawn of the Dead, which was just epic. I was kind of seeing my first R-rated films now at this point, and the movie Alien, which I actually saw with my dad, and begged him to leave. And he said, no, you dragged me to see this, you're going to stay and watch it. And I'm glad he did, because it's one of my favorite films to this day. So these were wonderful times to kind of be alive in the late 70s, just with what we were seeing coming on television, and with Battlestar Galactica, and of course, you get Star Wars, and we saw this wonderful future coming, and we wanted to embrace it in the biggest way possible. And video games quickly became the vehicle of kind of embracing what we thought was very futuristic and modern. So Johnny's mother would give Steve the money to take us to the arcades quite often. And what would happen is that we'd end up going, we'd climb into the back of this Camaro. Again, no seat belts, our lives were virtually hanging by a thread. He'd launch out of there sideways with Deep Purple playing on the 8-track like Batman coming out of the Batcave, and we'd be on our way. Sideways around virtually every corner, we're in the back. And at the time, I was kind of naive. I listened to a lot of, Elton John and Pablo Cruz, and a lot of the more kind of mellow pop music. So all of a sudden, now I'm getting introduced to heavy metal. I get this Black Sabbath, which I never heard, and I really liked it. And other really cool music like Kiss, like my favorite band Kiss at the time. And it wasn't long after I started going to Kiss concerts and having Kiss posters inside my room. So it was really kind of an epic time to be a teenager back then. But we'd go on these long journeys to the arcade, and it'd always be kind of a roundabout trip. You'd have to pick up his best friend and grab him, and then on the way there we'd have to stop again. I just want to get to the arcades. You'd stop and they'd have to hit a liquor store and get a six-pack. And you'd see him out there on the sidewalk, get loaded, climb back into the car, light the tires up, and we'd be off to the arcades. The minute with the back door open, we'd spring out of the back seat, race right into the arcades, grab a Coke, and usually he'd even kick us even more money. The mother would give us money, and then his brother Steve would kick us $1 or $2 just to keep our mouths shut about the beer and whatever else. So really fun times. You'd race inside. Now by this time you got even better games. You had, this is a really late part of the 70s, so now they introduced like the vector-based graphics of Asteroids, which is incredible. I love Asteroids. We had Space Invaders, And then one that I really liked, which is kind of an unusual, kind of a 2D scroller, with almost looked like a three-dimensional environment, was called Sky Raider. Really cool. You're kind of looking down. It had like kind of a curved effect to it, and you see rivers, and there's factories and bridges and planes coming, and you're just like on a bombing, strafing run, and you're shooting the planes that are coming towards you. Really an awesome game. I put a tremendous amount of quarters into that game. But even after that one, not long after, they had Galaxian, which became my favorite Namco game. I couldn't get enough of it. I actually liked it even better than Space Invaders and put more time into it. Probably was the only other game next to Sprint that I was really good at, because probably the time I put into it. So looking back on the 70s, it was just a tremendous amount of time in the arcades. Later in the 70s, once a home system, the Atari 2600 kind of came on the scene, not a lot of kids had them, but a few did. And I had a couple good friends, probably 3 friends at the time. I would kind of alternate and go to all their homes. We didn't really have the money for something that my parents thought it was kind of an extravagant luxury at the time, so I didn't have a 2600. Although they'd buy me a lot of really nice board games that I enjoyed, and would buy me cars for my electric racing set, which at the time I really appreciated. But I just loved to go to my friend's home. Quite often, it was comprised of being down in some, dark dungeon basement with black light posters and old beer signs on the wall, or you'd be up in an attic with a lot of wood grain paneling or something like that. Just a lot of times, good times, in friends' homes, watching TVs, going to the movies, hitting the arcades, and really taking in kind of the vibe of the 70s. It really was kind of a neat time between the music, the overall decor that we had at the time. Some people hated growing up in that period. I actually liked it. I have fond memories. Now, you can't go back, but I had great memories of that period in time. Kind of near the very tail end of the 70s, even at school, for the first time, Mattel came out with these handheld games. They had a little football game, a basketball game, and I think they had this like a missile command game. They were little handhelds, the first ones I'd ever seen. So I'm like, I already, chomping at the bit because my friends have the Atari 2600. Now Mattel comes out with this. I'm like, those bastards, and here they are, these awesome little handheld games. You'd, wear your friends down trying to get the thing for a few minutes from out of their hands and play it a little bit. And I loved it. I had one friend that would even let me keep it overnight once in a blue moon. I had to usually trade my baseball cards or something for that experience, but it was well worth it. Great times with a handheld console. Great times on the Atari 2600. Now, later there would be many more games and consoles coming, but at the time, this is what we had. There were great memories looking back on it. Of course, you can't go back and relive those kind of experiences, although today you can certainly buy those consoles and put those cartridges in. And sometimes for me, it's just enough to and I still have friends today that actually have some of those consoles, to put that cartridge in just to hear the sounds, just to feel the toggle switch, to touch the little wood grain veneer on the machine is almost enough for me. I have wonderful memories looking back and the little, kind of playing those things out in the arena of my mind. So the 70s is finally kind of coming to a close. We're very excited about what's around the corner in the 80s, and we were very unsure what the 80s was going to be about, but we liked where it was going. We liked the films at the time. We loved the direction of the music, and the concerts were epic. I mean, it was just a great time to be a kid. This is kind of the high school time, kind of like the Dazed and Confused period of time, growing up in that time period. Just lots of wonderful sleepovers with friends, and camping trips, and like I said, skateboarding and riding our bikes. This is even before the BMX bike thing really took off. So we're kind of at the early stages of many fun elements, which today a lot of kids frankly take for granted. It kind of brings me to my next point, which is that we really have it so good today. I've said this before in one of my other rants, but it's never been better. The accessibility of games, the availability, every household has a gaming console, an entertainment center. We didn't have any of that as a kid. So again, we kind of gravitated towards those arcades and those good times. But they're great memories looking back, and I'll never forget them as long as I live. So I wanted to kind of bring this with you. I was excited about sharing it. It's a period in time that I'll always be very fond of. It's kind of stayed with me, the 70s and even the 80s, a lot of that. So I hope you enjoyed it. My name is Dean Thompson. Thank you so much for watching. You've been watching another Escape to Gaming. I'm going to have more rants coming up on the 80s, the awesome 90s, the 2000s, each of these periods in time. So I hope you enjoy them, and there'll be many more reviews and things coming as well with all these awesome games we've got coming around the corner. So stay tuned, and thank you so much for watching and supporting this channel. See you guys.